Hello bookworms! Today we're going to be talking about whether you should read the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy by Cixin Liu, with the first book being The Three-Body Problem. I'm going to give you a little bit of context about the creation of the book series, then I'll get into a synopsis, and then I'm going to give you a broad review of the entire series without spoiling anything, and then at the very end of the video I will get into spoilers, like with some specifics in the 3 books in the series, but I'll give you fair warning before that happens. It's such a cohesive story told across the 3 books. I felt like giving you a series overview would be more helpful in helping you decide if this is a series that you want to spend time reading. This is the first full series that I completed in 2025, and I read all 3 books back to back. Remembrance of Earth's Past is a hard sci-fi series, and the first book in the series, The Three-Body Problem, was also the winner of the 2015 Hugo Award for Best Novel. I also thought it was interesting to note that The Three-Body Problem was the first full-length work of Chinese science fiction that was translated into English, and it happened as recently as 2014. The best way to go into the Three-Body Problem series is to know as little as possible about the overarching plot. The most basic synopsis I can offer is that humanity is faced with an extraterrestrial threat from a species that leaves our society looking as comparatively insignificant and antiquated as a colony of ants. The series as a whole hypothesizes how humanity would handle said threat, both emotionally and physically, and it explores different factions that might appear, as well as the goals their organizations would strive toward. My brother had been begging me to read this series for years, and I'm so glad that I finally did it, despite the psychological trauma that some of the ideas in this book have left me with. I was always a little bit intimidated by this series, but my husband Andrew and I watched the first season of the Netflix adaptation, and watching that really sparked my interest in finally picking up the books, and I'm so glad that I did. It actually also helped me tick off 3 of my reading goals for the year all in one go. So to read more sci-fi, read more of my physical TBR books, and complete series. So that was definitely a win as well. If you're not someone that would consider themselves a seasoned science fiction reader, I would caution you from starting your journey here. The series is very high concept. I used to read a ton of science fiction when I was younger, but it's admittedly been a little while since I've done so. I've dabbled in some things here and there, like I've read Andy Weir's books and the occasional John Scalzi, but I haven't really read hard sci-fi in a while, and I myself will say that this felt like a challenging place for me to really dip my toes back in. But I do think that having watched the TV adaptation first did help me to wrap my head around some of the ideas presented a little bit more easily, and it was also really helpful to have those visual touch points kind of in the back of my mind whenever I was feeling the slightest bit lost. However, I will say that I don't know if I would have enjoyed the show as much if I had read the books first, because as the old adage goes, the book was definitely better. I have not yet watched the 29 episode Chinese adaptation of the show, but I very much want to do that as well. From what I understand, it's available on YouTube with subtitles, so I do want to check that out at some point too. So to say that this series consumed my every waking thought would be an understatement. I even watched a YouTube video of Neil deGrasse Tyson explaining the unsolvable orbital mechanics concept of the three-body problem, since I really did want to understand it from a scientific lens outside of both the show and the book, and I do think that that was also helpful, though they do describe it very well in the show. I also wanted to share this quote from Cixin Liu, which comes from an article in The Guardian regarding the success of the three-body problem. "All we had hoped for was just to let American readers become aware that there is sci-fi in China. Now that it has been embraced by readers in the UK and the US, it supports an idea I once had. Sci-fi as a literary vessel is the most global, the most universal storytelling with the capability to be understood by all cultures. Sci-fi novels are concerned with problems faced by all of humanity. Crises in sci-fi mostly threaten humanity as a whole. This is a unique and treasurable trait inherent in the genre, that the human race is perceived as a single entity, undivided." The author Cixin Liu became a fan of science fiction in China during the Chinese Cultural Revolution when he secretly read a copy of Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was a book that his father had hidden in like a bin, and he had to read it in secret because it was a banned book. And then one last little disclaimer before I get into a review of the actual book, but if you do watch the Netflix adaptation of The Three-Body Problem first, just know that it will spoil things that happen in later books. It doesn't just cover book 1. It actually surpasses the ending of book 1 and starts giving you information about things that happen in book 2. And there's even a plot line from book 3 that occurs in the first season. So they really are laying seeds early in order to have some of these things come to fruition in later seasons, which I think was a good choice, but it does spoil things. So just note that going in. Okay, so now for the review portion of the video. So the English translation of the book starts off with a scene that is set during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Interestingly, the scene was buried later in the book in the Chinese version in order to avoid the eyes of Chinese censors. If I were to guess, I would imagine that it shows up as a flashback, but Cixin Liu has been quoted as saying that because that scene is at the very beginning of the English translation, which is where he intended it to be, he sees that version of the story as the truer one. When I started reading the series, I really was not very familiar with any information about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So I do feel like possibly hindered my enjoyment of the opening scene. I mean, the opening scene is pretty harrowing. It's not like an enjoyable scene, but I feel like having more context on the history would have been helpful, although it did spur me to go and look up more information about it and to learn a little bit. So I do see that as a positive, but overall, I definitely enjoyed the scenes that were set in the present day timeline more so than the opening scene, which is set in the 60s in China. Ken Liu, who translated books 1 and 3 in the series, he did also include some helpful footnotes. So I would say that that was really nice while reading. If you're listening to the audiobook, you don't have the option of listening to the footnotes. And I know that because my brother listened to it on audio, whereas I read it, so I was able to reference those footnotes. And while they were helpful, I wouldn't say it got me like completely up to speed, but it was a nice addition. But if you're also unfamiliar with the Chinese Cultural Revolution, at this point in history, anything that was seen as like a technological advancement was very much discouraged, and people who were considered intellectuals or academics were often imprisoned or executed for their ideas. It is now widely accepted to criticize this time in history in China, as long as you don't criticize Mao, who was the leader during that time. But personally, knowing that, I felt like this was kind of a brilliant point for the story to begin with, because progress was severely hindered during this time, but technological advancement and outside of the box thinking would really be humanity's only hope for solving an impending extraterrestrial threat. So I think starting at like the lowest point where that is so discouraged, and then getting to a point where technological advancements are not only encouraged, but an absolute necessity for survival. It was just like a nice arc to see. Also, side note, the extraterrestrials in the series are called Trisolarans, and they come from the planet Trisolaris. Trisolaris means 3 suns. The 3-body problem, as we discussed earlier, is the issue that they're having with the 3 suns, but it's also likely that Solaris could be a reference to Stanislaw Lem's classic sci-fi novel Solaris. I also want to note that as a primarily high fantasy reader, a lot of my enjoyment from consuming novels comes from characterization, character development. I really love to like latch onto characters and just feel those like intense emotions as they go through their journey. That's really what drives me to read and causes me to like really enjoy certain series. The 3-body problem is not at all like that. It's definitely more focused on the plot and the philosophical questions that plague humanity. And it's also very much about the explanations and applications of scientific theory. Throughout the entirety of the series, there were only a very select few characters that I felt were really fully developed and that I really did latch onto. And it's also worth noting that the main character shifts in each book. So we have a different main character in book 1, book 2, and book 3. So even if you do get attached to a particular perspective, there's a good chance that you're not really going to be following them very much in the latter books. My favorite book in the series is the second book, The Dark Forest, and this is actually the only one in the series that was not translated by Ken Liu. This one was done by Joel Martinson, and in this book we're following a character named Luoji, which actually translates to logic in Chinese. Luoji was the main character in book 2, and he was definitely the character that I felt the most attached to throughout the entire series. And I will also say that I felt like the main character in book 3 was the weakest of anyone that we followed. So part of what makes this book so just utterly bone-chilling is that it's a little bit too close to realistic for comfort for me. It really made me think about what it means to exist and humanity's place in the universe. We really do see a very dark side of humanity in this series, and ultimately the main question that's presented is whether humanity is worth saving. And when you really think about that, for me, someone who has always identified as an optimist, when I really think about that and just look at the things that are currently happening in our society, literally on a day-to-day basis, it makes me not confident in saying yes, which I would love to say yes to that, but I can't. And I think that that made me just so very deeply uncomfortable. But because I am an optimist, I do have to say, after I was trying to gather my thoughts for this, I was on my train ride home and I saw somebody give up their seat so that a mother and child could sit together. And I was like, okay, that actually makes me feel a little bit better about humanity. So that was a nice thing to see when I was feeling very existential. Something else that I found really interesting with my experience is that structurally, books 1 and 3, The Three-Body Problem and Death's End, worked best for me. These were the two that were translated by Ken Liu. There were shorter chapters, so I found it easier to digest, and I was more likely to say, okay, I guess I'll just read one more chapter because it's only, a couple more pages, whereas in book 2, The Dark Forest, the chapters are so much longer. So not being able to have a definitive stopping point on a train ride was something that did bother me, because I am one of those people that really likes to have a clear chapter break. I guess it doesn't really matter because you just, pick up where you left off, but I do really like feeling like I've completed something. But even with that being the case, book 2, The Dark Forest, was the undisputed best book in the series. And then this is kind of funny because it's not directly related to the series, but I also just wanted to note how much I really enjoyed the author note at the end of The Three-Body Problem. I felt like it gave me a lot of context on Cixin Liu's history and why he felt the need to write this story. And I also really agreed with his view about how a doomsday scenario is one of the things that would definitely cause humanity to come together as a whole, but ideally we really should do that before we're faced with a doomsday scenario. He also really delves into his love of science fiction, and I wanted to share this one quote because it really resonated with me. "I've always felt that the greatest and most beautiful stories in the history of humanity were not sung by wandering bards or written by playwrights and novelists, but told by science. The stories of science are far more magnificent, grand, involved, profound, thrilling, strange, terrifying, mysterious, and even emotional compared to the stories told by literature. Only those wonderful stories are locked in cold equations that most do not know how to read. Science fiction is a literature that belongs to all humankind. It portrays events of interest to all of humanity, and thus science fiction should be the literary genre most accessible to readers of different nations. Science fiction often describes a day when humanity will form a harmonious whole, and I believe the arrival of such a day need not wait for the appearance of extraterrestrials." Overall, I would say if you are interested in philosophical questions about humanity, about whether humanity is worth saving, if you're interested in seeing the way that political factions would play out in the event that we are presented with an extraterrestrial threat, The Three-Body Problem is something that you will find extremely fascinating. If you're someone that needs a character-driven story, this is definitely not the book for you. And if you are not up for hard sci-fi and reading some equations and just concepts that will probably be a little bit over your head, then this might not be the most enjoyable experience. If that's something that you feel like you can just kind of go with and you really are there for those philosophical questions, then I would definitely give this series a shot. I think it is absolutely worth reading. I've been thinking about it ever since I completed the third novel, and I've been talking about it ever since then too. My brother, as I mentioned, read the series, and him and I have been just discussing it nonstop, and we probably spent a good 2 hours talking about it and then ended by saying, wow, it feels like we've really only just scratched the surface of this discussion, because there really is just so much to dive into, and it's just so fascinating to me. It really makes me think so much more about the universe. I feel like there's so many things that we just take for granted on a day-to-day basis, and I like the fact that it really made me think more about what is going on around me. It made me feel like some of the things that I focus on are pretty trivial compared to just the vastness outside of us. But anyway, now I'm going to get into the spoiler section of the video. So if you have not yet read The Three-Body Problem, The Dark Forest, or Death's End, this is where you should absolutely turn the video off, unless you don't care about spoilers, but this is your warning. You are no longer safe to listen. Okay, so first and foremost, definitely what I found to be the most surprising was I expected book 1 to be an introduction to this threat from the Trisolarans, and I expected book 3 to come to a climax with like some kind of epic battle between humanity and the Trisolarans where they are just battling it out for control of Earth, and that was not the case. The closest thing that we have to a showdown is in the Dark Forest when we have the droplet scene, which is absolutely horrifying. This scene was like really mind-blowing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this come to life in the adaptation. I think that's going to be just incredible on screen. I also found it really interesting that neither side is 100% like on board with their race. There are people waffling on both sides of this war because we see like Yi Wenji, who is so disillusioned from the Chinese Cultural Revolution. She ultimately is the person that changes the entire course of Earth's history by having that first contact with the Trisolarans, and she chooses to do that despite receiving a message from the listener on the Trisolaran side, who basically begs her not to answer this call from these radio waves. They say that the Trisolarans are not friendly. They will come, they will destroy your race in order to basically steal and inhabit your planet. She hears that and is like, yeah, but humanity is past saving. Maybe something wiping us out would be ultimately better. So she just decides to answer this call anyway. I did appreciate how this is such a vast story and it is so encompassing, but it does ultimately come down to one person being the person that changes Earth's history. Another thing that I did really like, this part was in the Three-Body Problem, but all of the pieces that took place in the VR game, I thought that that was so much fun. I really liked that, obviously, in the adaptation, and it was really fun to read about it in the book too. I'm curious if I would have enjoyed it even more if I hadn't known that it was real, but I guess I'll never know. I mean, that's not really like a new trope. That is something that's done in one of my childhood favorite sci-fi books. So I just felt that despite it not being like groundbreaking, it was really fun. My absolute favorite element of the story as a whole is in book 2, the Wallfacer program. I think it was so interesting to see the minds that Earth decided to choose as the Wallfacers and the way that these intellectuals were forced to think. Just the weight on their shoulders of being the ones that are responsible for finding a solution. I really enjoyed Luoji's journey while he's trying to figure out why he was appointed, and I also just loved the scenes directly afterward. He did not understand why he was picked to be a Wallfacer, and he didn't want the job. He tried to quit. Everybody was just like, okay, but they assumed that it was part of his plan and just kept treating him as though he were a Wallfacer. So he ended up ultimately using resources to better himself, and then he did end up, because of his like out of the box thinking, he did end up being the one that had the best theory of what to do. The Dark Forest now is like the widely seen solution to the Fermi paradox, which is about how like there's all extraterrestrials out in the universe, but it's quiet. So essentially the Dark Forest is saying that everyone is a predator and it's a dark forest because you don't want to make yourself known. So by blowing up the star, Luoji made their presence known. He blew up a star that was pretty close to Trisolaris, and that essentially alerted the rest of the Dark Forest to this predator that was lurking out there. So that was pretty interesting. I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. We also get a portion of book 1 that's told from the perspective of the Trisolarans, and I wasn't expecting that, but that is, or is it book 2? Now I'm struggling to remember like what happened in which books, but the Trisolarans are obviously aware of the Wallfacer program, and they assign someone from their society to each Wallfacer, and that person's job is to figure out their real plan, like uncover what's going on. The first one that happened when it ended up being this guy's wife, and when she said like, I am your wall breaker, I got chills. I was like, this is insane. And then speaking of things that just really disturbed me in the series, I made like a little list of bullet points of the things that I felt were the most chilling. So kicking things off in book 1, the physicist Wang Mao, he is seeing these numbers, like this countdown in his mind, and he doesn't know why, he doesn't know how to stop it, though the person that he keeps meeting with tells him to just stop doing his research and see what happens. So he ends up like taking all of these photos on a camera, and when he's developing the film, he sees this countdown that shows up on all of the physical photos, and he's so like chilled and disturbed by it, and he asks his wife to take photos, and she goes to take a photo of their son, and he's like, no, don't do that, like, because he just can't even imagine seeing that countdown like on top of his child, which was pretty crazy. Once the wife takes photos and he develops those, the countdown is not on any of the photos that she took, despite using like the same camera and everything. So I thought that was just really cool. Another thing that was just insane was the slicing of the cruise ship using the nanomaterials. This basically just like wiped out the entire ETO, which was an environmentalist organization on the side of the Trisolarans, despite them being humans. That was fascinating, but that scene was, oh my God, like just so many people were murdered in one go, and it was chilling. Then in book 2 at one point, there is like a false alarm that goes off for like a red alert, and it causes mass panic and everybody is trying to leave the planet. People are just completely disregarding any type of safety procedures. So there are so many unnecessary deaths that happen of people who are just trying to take off, even though it's like not their turn to go, because they just want to get off of Earth's surface. And that also was really upsetting to see, because that is what happens when there is mass panic. Next, this was like one of the coolest things I felt was when Luoji wakes up from hibernation and he's being inducted into modern society and trying to like understand how the world works now that it's been hundreds of years. There is a virus that the Trisolarians had actually infected our technology with that was specific only to Luoji, and it was essentially just like looking for him, and then all of the technology was basically just trying to kill him. So things that ran normally without issue, anytime that he would come into contact with them, they would just go on like assassination quest. And I really liked how Shi Kuang, the detective, employed his skills, like his old-time logic skills, in order to save Luoji's life time and time and time again. I also thought the mass immigration to Australia was insane. Like, it was so crazy to me that Earth would be so scared of this threat that they're essentially letting a race who isn't even here dictate how humanity can live and where we can live, and just like trying to get everyone to that one spot, and then seeing obviously like Australia not wanting all of these mass like immigrants coming in from other places, so then they're creating like a place that is just for people from Australia that's like a lot better off than the place where everyone else in the world is getting to go to. And then there were also groups that like sprung up during that time. Like one of them was a group that was essentially like rebels that were against this migration, and they were trying to preserve cities outside of Australia, stay in like countries outside of Australia, and they were seen as like so villainous, and like, how are these people doing this? The Trisolarans are going to like wipe us out when they see these people that are like not following the rules. And then there was also a group of people that was formed to help the migration and to like make sure everything was going as smoothly as possible. But once that whole thing flipped, like once people were able to move out of Australia again because they realized that the threat was no longer coming, the people who were the rebels and who were demonized were then seen as like the unsung heroes, and the people who were the heroes being on the side of like making sure that everything ran smoothly were then seen as the demons and the people who were wrong in this situation. A couple of times in the book there are scenes where public opinion just shifts so much, and that does happen over time. Political leanings and stuff too, like there's a pendulum that swings. It seems like the best place would be to be somewhere in the middle, but we always do go to these extremes, and just seeing like how the extremes change over time and like where things swing was really fascinating. And then also the communication with that one other life form in the dark forest when they're talking about like the lake and the fish, and that was also really, really chilling. So funnily funnily enough, like the thing that I found to be the most outlandish in the series was not the impending threat of extraterrestrials. It was not all of this technology that doesn't exist that Earth had to come up with. It was the love story between Yun Tiameng and Chen Jing. I just like couldn't wrap my head around Yun Tiameng going through so much trouble and like so much personal risk and so much risk to humanity in order to save this one person that he knew from childhood, even though they hadn't really ever spoken very much. Like they really did not have any kind of relationship going into things, but like he just always liked her. And then like the scale of like the things that he did was just a bit like unbelievable to me. However, I did really like the 3 fairy tales that were told that were in the 3rd book, Death's End. There's a point where the Trisolarans set up a meeting between Yun Tiameng's brain and Chen Jing. He ultimately like spent all of this time becoming a popular author in Trisolaran culture, writing down these fairy tales that he said were Earth fairy tales, but they were fairy tales that he made up that were infused with clues to give to Chen Jing so that humanity had a chance for survival. And during their meeting, there was a red light, a green light, and a yellow light. And anytime that the Trisolarans felt like there was information being exchanged that they didn't want, if it was like getting close to that, they would put on a yellow light. And Chen Jing and Yun Tiameng were told that if the red light ever goes off, they will just destroy her. And like, that's it. So they had to like be super careful with what they were talking about. And then he was like, why don't we just talk about like our fairy tales from childhood? So he told these 3 stories, but they were so infused with clues, and then Earth became obsessed with trying to solve the clues of these stories. And that was definitely my favorite part of book 3, because I felt like that was a little bit of fantasy kind of sneaking its way into this sci-fi story. And then lastly, I thought it was kind of interesting how in book 1 we see the Trisolarans dehydrate themselves whenever their planet was going through a chaotic era. So dehydrating themselves and essentially becoming a 2-dimensional life form was essentially their salvation and the way that they were able to continue on their civilization. But then in book 3, it is ultimately Earth being forced into like from 3 dimension to 2 dimension. That is Earth's downfall. So I just felt like that was almost like a sense of like poetic justice. So overall, I really, really enjoyed this series. It's one that I'm going to be thinking about for so many years to come, and I can definitely foresee myself rereading this. I didn't mention this at the beginning of the video, but there is, like, if you look on Goodreads at the series, there is a 4th book listed that's written by someone else, and it is endorsed by the author, which I think is why it is listed as book 4. However, it was actually fan fiction that was written, and it gained a really popular following, and that's why people have latched onto it, and that's why the author has sanctioned it, and it did get traditionally published. But from what I've heard, people don't really seem to love it as an actual next installment. I think it probably is fun as fan fiction, but it might take away from the message of the series because this does end on a pretty final note. So I have not read that, so I can't speak to that, but books 1 through 3, definitely worth the read in my opinion. If you've read The 3-Body Problem, let me know any thoughts or feelings that you have, and I will see you guys soon in a new video. Bye!